The modern world is always rushing and rushing, but it knows not where it rushes to. Frenetic, grasping, but eternally insufficient. Consumption without ending. It is energy without purpose. No vision, no truth. Form without meaning. Power without grounding. Lost and drifting through time. How can we live in this madness? We are bound in many ways to the fate of our civilization, but free to bear witness to the changing of seasons, and free to understand the reasons why things fall apart. Modern man looks upon the sad landscape of his world, where misery and suffering are steadily multiplying. Life becoming synthetic, only fit for the artificial. The true vitality of man is sedated by a steady stream of distractions, a saline drip of sensory stimuli, and the limitations of time claim another victim for the piles. In this series, we will be taking a journey back in time. So far back in time, in fact, that time somewhat loses its meaning. But such a journey is necessary if we wish to visit the world of tradition. A world that now exists only in the faintest of echoes, and only for those who listen closely enough to hear them. To make this journey, we will be relying on a special book, Revolt against the Modern World, as our vehicle. A book written by a man who wanted to lay down a testimony for those who are different, who are of a type that do not belong to this time. The man who wrote this book was the Baron Julius Evola, a man who has gifted the modern world with extensive philosophical writings on the world of tradition. Evola himself did not claim ownership over the ideas presented here. He saw himself as merely passing them on, keeping the torch lit until it could be handed off to the next generation. And now the torch lays at our feet, its flame barely flickering. Will we let what remains of this ancient, ever-burning light be snuffed out in the dirt, or will we pick it up and rekindle its flame and proudly bear it forth? However, we must know what makes it burn, and so we commence our journey back into the world of tradition and learn the wisdom of our ancestors. We begin at the beginning. In order to revolt against the modern world, we must first understand what is meant by the phrase, the modern world, and also what it means to revolt. When we think of the modern world, we tend to think of the here and now, the most current, up-to-date version of our world. Anything in the past is outdated and no longer considered modern. This progressive thinking is part of our sickness, as we will come to discover. Evola says that anything in recorded history can be considered modern, and that the first forces of modern decadence can already be seen occurring around the 8th to 6th centuries BC, followed by a second phase during the Roman Empire with the advent of Christianity, and a third phase, which was the twilight of the feudalism of the Middle Ages that culminated in the Reformation. And it was this decisive point that pushed us on a much more rapid downward trajectory, where we now find ourselves in the current phase of history. The first phase roughly corresponds with the limits of recorded human history and archaeological science, and beyond this time there exists only legends and myths rather than a chronologized history. However, Evola points out that even this first phase did not simply concoct its decadence out of thin air, but notes that it was the inheritance of the previous age, which was known in the classical world as the Iron Age, or in Eastern cultures as the Kali Yuga. This, of course, raises the question, if everything that is historical is still considered modern from the point of view of tradition, then where do we find tradition? Evola says we must look beyond the modern world, and in order to do so, we must first have an understanding of time. He writes, "In order to understand the spiritual background typical of every non-modern civilization, it is necessary to retain the idea that the opposition between historical times and prehistoric or mythological times is not the relative opposition proper to two homogeneous parts of the same time frame, but rather the qualitative and substantial oppositions between times or experiences of time that are not of the same kind." What Evola is saying here is that we cannot cling to the modern notion of time being linear, where prehistory came first, followed by modernity, existing one after the other in the same timeline. Instead, he is saying that these two things are such totally different experiences of time that they are not only not even comparable, but do not even exist within the same concept of time. What we are looking at is the difference between a cyclical concept of time, a view that was widespread in the ancient world and in the world of tradition, and a linear concept of time, which is something very modern. To put this another way, if you were able to step into the metaphysical world, what Plato would call the world of forms, this spiritual, ethereal realm where things exist as pure ideas and archetypes, then all events and possibilities of human history would be potentially coexisting in a cyclical pattern that is not subject to the laws of physics in the material world. Anything that can be considered eternal must have this cyclical nature, without beginning or end, and it is the eternal that the world of tradition is concerned with. The reason linear time exists is because matter exists. Because of the way that space works by separating matter into individual components, linear time necessarily becomes a factor. But in the metaphysical world, time doesn't exist that way. It doesn't need to, because it is not a material world. There is no matter. So it is possible there for events to coexist in a way where the past, present, and future are all one and the same. Imagine trying to explain time to an entity that has never experienced linear time and exists as an infinite being. How would you explain to them how something could exist and then not exist? How something could occur and then be over? Or how something could be created or destroyed? We may be oversimplifying things a bit here, but fundamentally, this is the difference between the eternal and unchangeable being and the ever-fluctuating, impermanent becoming. It is the opposition between being and becoming that represents, at the core, the opposition between the world of tradition and modernity. But why is it relevant to understand this different concept of time in order to define the modern world? According to Evola, it is a key feature of modernity. Evola writes in The Bow and the Club in his essay, The Civilization of Space and the Civilization of Time. Finally, it is worth recalling the conception of time which traditional civilizations had. Not an irreversible linear conception, but a cyclical, periodical one. A range of customs, rites, and institutions distinguish both higher civilizations as well as the echoes which survive of them in certain primitive peoples. These reveal a constant intention to bring time back to its origins, hence the cycle, which means destroying everything that represents mere becoming, curbing it or making it express or reflect supra-historical, sacred, or metaphysical structures often connected to myth. It was in such terms, as a mobile image of eternity, that time acquired value and meaning, not as history. This is important to keep in mind as we go forward. In the world of tradition, there is always an orientation towards that which is eternal. Tradition is always arising from or pivoting back to the eternal, and everything in the world of tradition, from rites to castes to kings, is aimed at recreating and expressing the eternal here on earth, always maintaining and renewing that connection. There is always a return, and it is that connection to eternity that was valued. Time simply was not viewed or experienced by primordial people in the same way that it is by modern people. Thus, when trying to understand the mythological world in which we will be looking for tradition, we will come up against large gaps in our understanding if we look at it through the lens of linear time. For example, creation myths might have some truth to them, but trying to interpret them literally in a linear time frame will make them seem implausible, because those stories are speaking to something that occurred in the metaphysical plane outside of linear time. The metaphysical reality testified to in the world of myth and legend has a very different form than physical space and chronological time. This concept is alien to modern man because he is too far removed from the experience of regular and close contact with the metaphysical, and in many cases does not even believe in an existence beyond that which he can detect with his five senses. This disconnect from the metaphysical world is a big part of the reason for our modern sickness. The modern person looks at history and believes he is an evolved form on the fast track to progress. He thinks that because his manipulation of matter is improving, through the use of his rational and technological abilities, that he is reaching a crescendo. But what is his aim? Presently, there is a push towards better and better artificial intelligence and robots. What greater declaration of the fallen state of man could there be than that he believes with euphoric certainty that his greatest achievement will be to create a synthetic replica of himself that has no soul, as the final and complete ending of the human experiment? How much more removed from nature and spirituality can we be when the culmination of our profane science is to create a materialistic, intelligent life form, devoid of any divine spark? When we think about the world of tradition, we should think of it as akin to a Platonic form. The real world is the metaphysical world. This world is a mere reflection of the real world. We often think of our material world as the real one, and the metaphysical as something imaginary, ghost-like, or fake. But in actuality, it is the other way around. And this will be critical for understanding why it is so hard to find genuine tradition throughout the ages. Because when these Platonic forms, these archetypes, enter into manifestation in the material world, and must then be governed by the laws of matter, it distorts the reflection. And these laws include time, which is perhaps the biggest factor in why these reflections are less than perfect, as entropy and decay naturally set in. If you were a primordial man, time would be less of a factor because of your ability to access and connect with the metaphysical. And we can see remnants of this today in those advanced ascetics who are able to enter into deep meditation. They may feel during that time that they have left their body and traveled for days or lived another lifetime, only to return and find that mere hours have passed. When one is in direct contact with the state of being, time becomes very relative indeed. A good example to illustrate this point can be found in The Lord of the Rings, a modern fiction that nonetheless contains traditional themes. Recall how Gandalf was lost to the Balrog, or so we thought. Instead, Gandalf the Grey tumbled down into the abyss, battling a most ancient demon, and Frodo and the rest of the Fellowship thought that was the end for poor Gandalf. But he returns as Gandalf the White not long after. As he relates his battle with the Balrog, he says, "Darkness took me, and I strayed out of thought and time. Stars wheeled overhead, and every day was as long as a life age of the earth." How is it possible for Gandalf to have been gone for what must have felt like millennia to him, only to return a short while later? The answer is that Gandalf entered the metaphysical world, the world of being, where the limitations of matter and linear time do not apply. We can compare this same idea to the Vedic cosmological system, which has measurements of time that are truly vast, in which we find Brahma, the creator god, for whom only 1 day of his life is equal to 4,320,000,000 years on Earth, and 100 years of Brahma's life is the equivalent to only one single breath of Manavishnu, who creates and destroys universes with every breath. So for traditional man, if he wanted to be constantly in communion with God, this is the realm he would need to access. And because he would be entering into different spiritual dimensions, the laws that govern this plane would not apply, and thus he would experience time very differently because he is not spending all his time in the linear temporal realm. We can see a remnant of this in the languages of primitive people, in which they may have many unusual grammatical tenses for indicating time, or no tenses at all. Time is essentially just an illusion that we are subject to, that we have agreed to participate in during our time in the material world. We are governed by it because we cannot apprehend a different state of being. This leads us then to what it means to revolt against the modern world, now that we have some understanding of what the modern world actually is. Evola makes only a brief but clear mention in the foreword of the book of what the path of revolt entails, setting the tone for what will be laid out in the rest of the book. What he tells us is this: what is really needed is not to toss back and forth in a bed of agony, but to awaken and get up. What does he mean by this? He says that reacting and protesting are not sufficient. We need instead actions, not reactions, which originate from the inner dimension and testify to the possession of a foundation, a principle, or a center. In order to revolt, one must spiritually awaken and orient towards these inner principles. We shouldn't try to pick up faded transmission signals from the past in order to mimic them. Instead, we need to recreate the original event. We need modern ascetics and spiritual guides, and in absence of them, we need to become sages unto ourselves as we seek divinity. Evola criticizes modern politics as being reactionary, and because it is reactionary, there is always a tactical lag. One cannot defend tradition in this way. Tradition must be embraced and cultivated internally. The modern world is filled with people who have too much free time on their hands, which they use unwisely. They believe they are fighting the slide into decadence by arguing their political talking points and feeding their outrage, when what they ought to be doing is reading, meditating, and making an art of living in a positive, constructive, and wholesome way. Be in the world, but not of the world. Before we go further, we must have a clear understanding of Evola's methodology. In exploring the metaphysical realm and the world attested to by myths and legends, the rational, empirical, scientific method will not serve us. The scientific method, while quite good at helping us understand the physical world, is useless when it comes to helping us to understand the metaphysical. About his methodology, Evola writes,
"In the course of this book, I will refer to various Eastern and Western traditions, choosing those that exemplify, through a clearer and more complete expression, the same spiritual principle or phenomenon. The method that I use has as little in common with the eclecticism or comparative methodology of modern scholars as the method of parallaxes, which is used to determine the exact position of a star by reference to how it appears from various places. Also, this method has as little in common with eclecticism, to borrow an image of Ganon's, as the multilingual person's choice of the language that offers the best expression to a given thought. Thus, what I call the traditional method is usually characterized by a double principle, ontologically and objectively by the principle of correspondence, which ensures essential and functional correlation between analogous elements, presenting them as simple homologous forms of the appearance of central and unitary meaning, and epistemologically and subjectively by the generalized use of the principle of induction, which is here understood as a discursive approximation of a spiritual intuition, in which what is realized is the integration and the unification of the diverse elements encountered in the same one meaning and the same one principle.
It is important to understand what he means by this. He is saying that he will be drawing from both Eastern and Western traditions, not to appear well-read and worldly or to impress anyone with his wide knowledge, but to find the best examples of a concept possible, sometimes looking at the same concept from different cultural, religious, or historical perspectives. He is looking for the best vantage point from which to view tradition, and if there are no sufficient Western examples, then he will look to Eastern examples, and he posits that they are integrated into one meaning, which is to say that the principles that underlie tradition retain the same meaning regardless of the material context they are drawn from. His traditional method is one that is not necessarily rationally and empirically based, but more ephemeral and abstract. However, he will aim to show a correspondence between both the objective and metaphysical nature of existence. This is essentially the Hermetic principle of as above, so below. We can make inferences about the metaphysical world and therefore about the world of tradition by observing their imperfect reflections in the material world, and by observing similarities across these reflections, we can start to pinpoint the core of divine truth that underlies them all. Rather than relying on the deductive reasoning that is favored in the modern world, he will make a generalized use of inductive reasoning with the goal of trying to integrate many different remnants of tradition and unify them under the umbrella of a shared metaphysical principle. This includes a heavy use of symbolism, allegory, and myth, as well as a keen spiritual intuition. Evola explains this methodology and why he uses it more thoroughly in his book, The Mystery of the Grail. He writes,
"The characteristic feature of the method that I call traditional, in opposition to the profane, empirical, and critical intellectual method of modern research, consists in emphasizing the universal character of a symbol or teaching, and in relating it to corresponding symbols found in other traditions, thus establishing the presence of something that is both superior and antecedent to each of these formulations, which are different from and yet equivalent to each other. Since any one tradition may have given to a common meaning a more complete, typical, and transparent expression than have the others. Seeking to establish correspondences is consequently one of the most fruitful ways to understand and integrate what in other cases is found in a more obscure and fragmentary form."
In other words, he is looking for similarities across traditions, and it is in those similarities that we start to understand the clearer and fuller picture of metaphysical reality. Each piece of evidence on its own is just one small puzzle piece that can tell us very little about the bigger picture in isolation. But as we collect more and more of these puzzle pieces and the picture starts to come into view, we can also see where other pieces fit that did not initially look like they belonged to the same picture. A thread of history can be grasped, and later doctrines with their own historical developments can be tested by their conformity with tradition, even if only partially understood. Indeed, the universality of a symbol or story, combined with a firm design, is a test in itself. It is no coincidence, for example, that numbers like 108 or its multiples appear over and over, found in places far-flung across time and space, from Vedic India to Babylon, from the Norse Valhalla to the temples of Angkor, or when the death and rebirth of solar figures is rehearsed across the globe, far back into antiquity, or when myths of a cataclysmic deluge propagate every corner of the earth. None of this is a coincidence. All of this is speaking to the ways in which something that exists eternally in the metaphysical realm is cropping up over and over again, in various manifestations in the physical world, reflected through the lens of this or that culture in a way that can be understood by a given people. We will try to look for the pure reality behind the reflected image of those lenses. When we see the same themes coming up over and over again, that is our cue to look deeper. Evola divides this book up into two parts. The first part is called The World of Tradition and will illustrate the main principles that the life of traditional man would manifest. And the second part is called Genesis and Face of the Modern World, which will discuss the processes that have led to the development of the modern world and lay out a metaphysical view of history. Evola states that he will be offering guiding principles and laying out only the essential elements as a kind of roadmap for those who are capable of an awakening, to point them in the direction they need to go. It is this roadmap that we will be relying on in order to rediscover the world of tradition. Along the way, we will collect more and more kindling for the torch that has been left to us to carry, in the hopes that it will burn brightly once more.
Coils of light altering to infinity, give me sight and a sense of my destiny, connect me to the transcendent mystery.